Welcome to the second episode of my brand new podcast, Corpora's Corner Podcast. You subscribe to this podcast on iTunes. Check me out on Twitter at Ryan_Corpora. Check out my YouTube page. And in a few days, check out my brand new website, ccpodcast.com. My guest today will be Sports Illustrated's college football analyst, Zac Ellis. Enjoy. College football writer for Sports Illustrated, Zac Ellis. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So we're about midway, 3/4 of the way through the college football season. This past weekend, we had a lot of upsets. We had Louisville, Washington, we had Georgia, South Carolina, UCLA, Clemson. A lot of teams went down. What was your most surprising upset this past weekend?
Yeah, I think this past weekend was kind of the first weekend where we really saw any real change in kind of the top of the college football order. The first few weeks, everything kind of went according to plan, how people expected, but this weekend was really crazy. Something like 5 top 10 teams went down. I think, looking at it, I think you have to look at South Carolina losing, and I think Georgia losing are pretty surprising to me. Florida losing to Missouri. I think that Missouri is one of those teams right now that people, myself included, weren't entirely buying into early on with their undefeated record because they hadn't really played anybody, kind of like a Maryland early on in the year, starting like 4 or 5-0. But going into Athens like they did a couple weekends ago, and playing Florida at home like they did, reeling off something like 500 yards of offense, I think they've proven, even against two teams that are kind of depleted with injuries, that they can hang, especially in that SEC East. And I think that was one of the more telling results from the weekend. I also think, like I said, South Carolina going into a place in the old stadium in Knoxville, which has not been a very difficult place to play the last few years, even though it historically was. And it seems now that while the Vols are probably not contending for any division title anytime soon, they hung well with Georgia, almost beat them in overtime, and then took a South Carolina team that's pretty underrated, I think, offensively, and handled them pretty well there at the end. So I think that it's just amazing how the SEC East right now is kind of, it's anybody's race. Even though Missouri has got kind of a 2-game lead on anybody right now, everybody else has at least 2 losses, and it's all teams that have historically been contenders in that division. And so it's really interesting to see what's going to happen here in the next few weeks as the season goes on in that division.
One of the teams that lost, Louisville, lost on, I believe, Friday night to UCF. They fell really far in the polls. I feel like they were a team that couldn't afford a loss because of their strength of schedule. Do you find any way Louisville can, they're not going to contend for a national title, but come back in and be in a BCS game?
Yeah, I could see that happening just because of how weak that American Conference is, and that's been the big reason. You're right. You touched on it. They didn't have any room to lose. Much like how Teddy Bridgewater, the quarterback, didn't have much room for error in the Heisman race. His Heisman shot's pretty much gone because with that, whether fair or not, with that weak schedule they had, where they really weren't going to be playing at the beginning of the year, they weren't going to be playing anybody that was ranked in preseason top 25. You had to see a guy like Bridgewater go out and basically just pick apart these teams and be near perfect, even garner any attention because you're not having those big games. And now I think you see kind of the same thing happening with the team as a whole and their BCS changes. There's not a lot that can happen, or not a lot that can happen with their schedule where they can't really stumble and hope to stay up there with, a one-loss team from one of the major conferences. But I do think, like you said, there's still a lot of season left to play. It's them and UCF pretty much in that conference that is probably going to be, up there in that league, which is a pretty weak league, to be considered for a BCS spot. So there's still a shot, but that definitely hurt them there, that loss on Friday night.
Well, another thing that hurt them was Teddy Bridgewater's Heisman campaign. That took a hit after Friday night. At right now, with Johnny Manziel the way he's playing, he lost this past weekend, but the way he's been playing this season, Marcus Mariota, all these guys, who do you think has the front running right now to win the Heisman?
I would still give the edge to Marcus Mariota right now with the way he's played this year. I think that this past weekend really pushed Jameis Winston of Florida State up towards the top as well, but I don't think quite yet that he surpasses the consistency that Mariota's putting up in kind of in a really tougher conference right now. There's a lot of good things happening in the Pac-12, and a lot, there's a good debate right now as to whether or not the Pac-12 might actually be better than the SEC because the SEC with all those upsets, it either means that the bottom teams are getting good or the top teams are getting bad, one of the two, if not both. And so I think that looking at what he's doing, Mariota is doing in the Pac-12 is really impressive on both, being able to be a threat in the air and on the ground. I do think that Winston, he obviously, that was a huge win for him this past weekend in the weekend's biggest game against Clemson, because that's a very tough place to play. They go on and really just dominate that Tigers team that had really been, a very good team throughout this year. But the trouble for Winston is that that's probably the toughest game he's going to face this year. Later on down the road, I mean, there's a few more, but that was, I mean, looking at what Mariota has to face, I think he has a better shot at kind of gaining recognition for that Heisman spot. I would give it to him right now in a slight edge over Winston. But like you said, Johnny Manziel, I think he's still in it. Historically, he's limited because only one player's ever won it twice, but it's interesting because how much do historical limitations really apply to him, because this time last year, a freshman hadn't won either. He was the first one to do that. So you kind of have to throw all that stuff out of the window and say there's a possibility for it to happen, especially with his popularity and how he's playing even in losses. And they've got 2 losses right now, but they had 2 losses last year. Texas A&M did when Manziel won it. So I think there's still plenty of season left to play, but I think those 3 right now are your finalists if I had to vote right now.
Do you think that Johnny Manziel's off-the-field stuff is going to hurt his Heisman campaign?
At the beginning of the season, I would have said yes, and I think I did tell some people that, because I do think that, I mean, there were some traditional voters last year that were hesitant to vote for him simply because he was a freshman, and a lot of people were really, entrenched in that tradition of it being kind of an upperclassman award, and it had historically been that way. And some, a lot of people, former winners themselves, had said that there should be a lot of, or maybe not a lot, but at least part of the consideration of the award should be put onto what a player does off the field, how he represents the team, how he represents himself. And I thought that would actually play into it. But you look at how he's playing right now, no one is talking about what he did off the field anymore. And it's amazing because as many headlines as he grabbed in the off season for negative things, a lot of which were self-inflicted, so much of that right now has kind of been forgotten in light of the way he's played. And that's what's interesting about Manziel is that, people can debate all they want what he's like off the field, if he's a little bit too cocky here and there, but you're not going to hear one person saying that the guy's a bad player, because he's an incredible football player, and nobody's really going to doubt that. I think that right now, even with 2 losses on his team, that's what's dominating the narrative for him, and that's the best shot he has, I think, to get back to New York.
Talk about Mariota and Winston. They're right now 2 and 3 in the BCS. The BCS polls came out last weekend. The top 5 reads Bama, Florida State, Oregon, Ohio State, and Missouri. And it seems that with Florida State's win, they jumped Oregon in the polls. But the forgotten team that everyone forgets about is Ohio State. They're sitting there at 4. If all these teams win out, what are the chances that Ohio State can make a play for a BCS national championship?
See, I'm not sure that they would at this juncture. If it were to stay, if the current rankings stayed at how they were, and if they went out, as you say, I think Ohio State's on the outside looking in, and that was in a lot of the ways at Louisville. That was kind of the hit on Louisville early on was their schedule. I think Ohio State, even though they're in a major conference, most of their tough games were at home this year. Their toughest team that they've played, as far as the ranking is concerned, during this 17, 18 game winning streak they have going, was Northwestern a couple weeks ago, and they were ranked at number 16 or something like that. Now, they're a good team, but knowing who they've played, knowing who they've beaten, I'm not sure you give them a nod over an Oregon or an Alabama, in my opinion. And I think that a lot of people share that opinion because that's been kind of the criticism of Ohio State since the preseason. And so I think that if the status quo remained unchanged right now, I do think that you would see Ohio State on the outside looking in as far as the chance of getting a national title berth.
Now, Florida State jumped Oregon in the rankings. Do you think if they both went out, do you think it's going to stay that way, or do you think Oregon's going to eventually jump back over?
I think Oregon will eventually jump back over because of the reason that I said, and that's that, that down the road, Oregon's still got a few more tough games. And I think that there's not enough tough games. I think there's not enough tough games for Florida State in their ACC schedule to really keep them above Oregon, because the ACC is extremely top heavy right now with the best teams that they have. You've got the Clemson is still a good team despite the loss. You got Florida State, you got Virginia Tech, you got Miami. Everyone else, it's kind of a question mark. And I think that you see a little more parity in the Pac-12, and that's gonna, in my opinion, that's gonna really help Oregon when it comes to BCS standings. I think they jumped Florida State back. And I don't think that the margin is as razor thin as it is now.
The last thing I want to talk about is the situation happening down in Miami. The NCAA came out, gave him a 9 scholarship, revoking of 9 scholarships. They had a self-imposed ban of a 2-year bowl ban prior to that. Do you think they were let off the hook easy, or because there was a lot of talk about death penalty getting thrown around and all that kind of stuff, and it just seems that Miami kind of got off the hook a little bit. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's two sides to it. I mean, if you look at and actually read the report and look at what the NCAA found that Miami did and that booster Nevin Shapiro did in those years that he was around the program, I think there's no question that you look at it and say that they definitely got off easy. But the other side of it is the publicity around the NCAA's investigation into Miami has been very negative for the NCAA. And I think that definitely played into the decision with them, knowing that, listen, we kind of botched this investigation. We're extremely inconsistent with a lot of the rulings that we laid down, and I think that they didn't want to hammer too hard, knowing that really they did not investigate and give the due process as well as they could have. But I think if you're asking just straight on, what Miami had done, what the report stated, I think they definitely got off easy. And really, this is another example, kind of like Oregon's a couple of months back when they kind of got off easy with some scholarship losses. I think that you look at this and it's an example of how there's really no incentive not to cheat for major teams because you're not getting hit as hard as people might expect anymore. I think that's a problem for the NCAA. You've got, there's inconsistent rulings left and right. I mean, a good example of that is the former Miami basketball coach Frank Haith, who's now at Missouri. I mean, the report stated that he essentially funneled money in, to try and as kind of hush money for Nevin Shapiro to keep him quiet. And the guy gets a 5-game suspension for 5 really, cupcake games in Missouri's schedule this year. Compare that to something like a Bruce Pearl who lied about having a barbecue at his house for a recruit, and he's entering his 3rd year of not coaching. I think that it's hard for any person of reasonable mind and body to look at that and say that's fair. I think that's the trouble that NCAA has across the board is just blatant inconsistency with their rulings, and I think this is just another example of that.
Zach, I appreciate you taking the time, always talking to us, and we'll definitely be talking to you very soon.
Ryan, I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.